Hello and welcome to the next of our full course lectures. This lecture is going to be on corporate social responsibility. So we're moving on beyond our corporate governance that we've been talking about up to now in the course, and we're starting to look at corporate social responsibility. So there are a few areas that we're going to consider here. We're going to consider corporate citizenship and what that actually means. We're also going to consider a certain model of corporate social responsibility set out by Carroll. Then we're going to think about all of the stakeholders and what stakeholders are within a business. How should we treat those stakeholders and how does that feed into corporate social responsibility? So first things first, let's talk about this CC. So we've got our corporate citizenship. What are we talking about when we think being a good corporate citizen or having that corporate social responsibility that we're talking about? Well, we have a corporate legal entity here. What that means is that that legal entity has a responsibility to others. Effectively, that is a citizen. It's a legal entity, it's an individual, and that citizenship must be treated with responsibility. So the legal entity that is our corporation should have that responsibility to others within the general community. Now, the question is, do we have that responsibility to others, and does the company discharge that responsibility to others in a responsible way? Or do they just have a responsibility to shareholders to try to increase shareholder wealth, which we discussed in one of the previous lectures? So a lot of these models around corporate citizenship and corporate social responsibility will consider this question. Is the corporate legal entity just looking to try and increase shareholder wealth? Or do they have a responsibility to others? Should they be considering, for example, society at large whenever they're thinking about how to discharge their responsibilities? So that's the sort of thing we're going to be considering in this lecture. And the first model we're going to look at is Carroll's model. So Carroll's model tries to define different areas of corporate social responsibility, and it thinks about how an organisation can look at those different areas and decide how it is going to discharge the responsibility that it has. So the first area that Carroll looked at was economic. And of course, economic focuses on that financial area that we've already mentioned. It focuses on the return that we generate for shareholders and how we can generate the best return, the best increase in shareholder wealth for those shareholders. But the economic side of things is not just that. It's not just thinking about investors and shareholders. We're also going to think more widely than that under corporate social responsibility. We're going to think about things such as treatment of employees. So that might be health and safety requirements. It might be giving them a fair pay for a fair day's work, for example. So treatment of employees takes this responsibility of the return to shareholders and takes it a step further. It says, well, we're not just concerned about shareholders. We also need to think about the employees that we have within the organisation. So if we've considered shareholders in this economic sense, and we've also considered employees, is there anyone else in an economic sense that we should consider? Well, what about customers? We should be providing a quality product to customers. So we need to think about that before we think about other things within the organisation. So we need to think first of all about our return to shareholders. Then we need to consider how we treat our employees. Then we need to think, well, we're providing a product to our customers. Are we providing a quality product? And in that way, we're starting to think not just about the return that the business can generate, but about other aspects of responsibility to society at large. So what we need to do is achieve these steps first before we try to move on to some of the other aspects of corporate social responsibility that we're going to talk about here. So we try to achieve these economic responsibilities first, the return to the shareholders, the treatment of employees, the quality product that we can provide to customers, before we go on to try and achieve some of these other aspects that we're going to talk about. So the next aspect that we can see here when it comes to corporate social responsibility under Carroll's model is our legal responsibilities as a corporate citizen. So legal responsibilities, first of all, mean that we act within the law. So if there's legislation that specifically refers to our industry and specifically refers to our business, well then we need to act within that legislation. So for example, there may be price fixing legislation that says we can't collude with others to fix the price of the product that we sell to consumers. Well then we need to act within that legislation. So that's not just legislation that's specific to our organisation, but that's all legal requirements to all corporations. So we need to consider that to be a good corporate citizen, we need to act within the law, we need to think about what the legislation is that applies to our organisation, and we need to apply it. So that's our legal responsibilities. The third responsibility will be our ethical responsibilities. Now we're going to look at ethics in more detail later on in the course. We have a few lectures on that, so we'll be looking at it in good amount of detail. But this is what is expected by society. Society expects corporations to act in a certain way, i.e. to act in a way that is conducive to society as a whole, to help society as a whole, not to act in their own interests only. For example, the banking industry is getting a lot of criticism at the minute because it doesn't seem to be acting in a way that helps society. If anything, they're acting in a way that damages society. So they're acting in a way that is concerned only with their own interests. They're not considering the interests of society as a whole, and that could actually damage society. So ethical requirements are those requirements over and above legal requirements when it comes to corporate social responsibility. So far we've thought about the economic responsibilities of the organisation, the legal responsibilities of the organisation, and now we add in, over and above the legal responsibilities, the ethical responsibilities of the organisation. So we achieve the economic first, then we think about the legal, then we move on up the chain and we think about the ethical. Finally, we will consider philanthropic. Okay, so what is philanthropic? Well, what that is donations and charitable acts by an organisation. So this could simply be charitable donations that they give voluntarily from the organisation to charities to support those charities. Also, it could be maybe sponsorship of certain charities or certain events, trying to give back to society. So as you can see, this is going a step further. This is over and above our economic responsibilities, our legal responsibilities, and our ethical responsibilities. This is actually giving back to society. So once we've achieved the economic, legal and ethical, we can actually move on to this higher plane of saying, well, let's give back. Let's be a really good corporate citizen and let's give charitable donations. Let's sponsor a certain charity or certain events so that we can therefore provide something for society as a whole. So those are the four aspects of corporate social responsibility in Carroll's model. And if you were asked in the exam to assess the corporate social responsibility of a certain organisation, those would be four good headings to use. Economic first of all, moving on to legal, through ethical and through to philanthropic. Carroll's model also considers the response of the organisation, and that's the response of the organisation to social pressures. So as we said, society does expect corporate organisations to actually provide something back to society. So they may well put the organisation under pressure to say, well, actually, we expect you to do this or we expect you to do that. So how the organisation responds to those requests is set out in Carroll's model. There are four responses that Carroll suggested the organisation could take. The first response would be reaction, effectively to deny responsibility. So really that's not being a terribly good corporate citizen, but some corporations will take this reaction. They will simply deny responsibility for whatever it is that they're being asked to do or being accused of doing. Or they could undertake a defence, i.e. they could do the least possible to get through, so they could take some sort of action. They could, rather than maybe denying responsibility, take responsibility for it, but do the least possible to actually try and fix it. So maybe just say, yeah, we're responsible for that, but it's not our responsibility to actually clean it up, to actually fix it. So that would be a second response that the organisation could take to social pressure around corporate social responsibility. Or they could go for accommodation. Now, accommodation would be taking responsibility and actually acting upon it. So saying, well, yeah, okay, we have, let's say, undertaken some environmental damage. We've damaged a certain area. So we are going to take responsibility for that and we're going to fix it. We're going to put it back the way it was before that actually happened. Finally, there is proaction. Now, proaction is to go beyond the requirement. So that would be to say maybe, well, yeah, okay, we take responsibility for the damage that we created. And not only are we going to fix it, but we're going to make the area better than it was before. So we're going to provide some sort of social maybe playground or something like that for society as a whole that wasn't there before, to actually go beyond what was required to set the thing right. So that's Carroll's model, first of all looking at the different areas of corporate social responsibility, and then looking at the organisation's response to social pressures around corporate social responsibility. So do be aware of those and be able to discuss them in the exam. When it comes to corporate social responsibility, what role do the shareholders have? What level of responsibility do the shareholders have to take? Well, really what we need to remember is that it's not the shareholders that are running the organisation. They have the management in place to do that for them. Now, the shareholders do have certain rights. Of course, they have the rights to sell the shares. For example, they may choose to sell the shares if they don't agree with the corporate social responsibility that is being undertaken by the organisation. They can also vote, so they could vote out certain things if they didn't agree with them, or vote against management on certain issues if they felt that the management were not making the organisation be a good corporate citizen. They also have the right to information. So all of the information that the organisation has should be provided to the shareholders. And of course, they have the right to sue if they feel that they've been treated badly by the management, or they feel that management haven't actually discharged their responsibilities correctly. However, although they have all those rights and they may be able to influence management to try to force them to be a better corporate citizen, well, they're not responsible for the company's actions, even though they are the owners. They're not responsible for the company's actions. Management will be responsible for those actions. So when we're discussing this corporate social responsibility, we're really thinking about what the management of the organisation have to do. So, when management have considered their corporate social responsibility, they'll have to think about the impact that that will have on their stakeholders. So, they'll have to think about, number one, who their stakeholders are. They'll also have to think about how they treat those stakeholders. And to do that, they'll need to understand the power that each of those stakeholders has. So what they'll do is they'll identify all of the stakeholders in the business. Remember, stakeholders will be those that have a legitimate interest in what the business does. That may be internal stakeholders like management, like the employees, or it could be external stakeholders. That could be stakeholders like customers, like suppliers, like banks, like the government. All of those people who interact with the business and will be affected by what the business does. So we can undertake a power analysis to see as a business who we should be talking to, what stakeholders will be impacted by the decisions that we make. So in a stakeholder power analysis, what we'll do is we'll identify those key stakeholders. Now we might classify those stakeholders, and we'll talk about the classification that you would have in a second. But once we've identified the stakeholders, what we'll do is establish their interest and their claims. So we'll see what interest they have in the business, and do they have a good claim to that interest? Do they have a legitimate interest in the business? We'll then determine their ability to influence us. Because really what we're going to do here is we're going to scale those stakeholders and decide who is the most important. Who do we really need to please? Who do we really need to consider? And those are the people that we're going to think about the most. The others, yes, of course, we will consider in the decisions that we make, but they won't have as much influence. So they maybe won't be as important to us. So we'll also try to identify any potential conflicts that we could have with stakeholders and then attempt to minimize that conflict if we possibly can. So I said at the start of this, when we're doing our power analysis, we'll identify the key stakeholders. During that, we may well classify those stakeholders. We may identify narrow stakeholders and wide stakeholders. Narrow stakeholders, I want you to think of stakeholders who are very close to the business. Employees, for example, who interact with the business each and every day. As opposed to wide stakeholders, like, for example, the government, who only interact with the organisation on a very occasional basis. So narrow and wide stakeholders we might identify. We may also classify them into primary and secondary stakeholders. Again, those who are closer will be primary. Secondary stakeholders won't have as close a relationship with the business. We'll also need to identify active and passive stakeholders. Those stakeholders that take a really keen interest in what the business is doing will be active stakeholders. Passive stakeholders, well, they may, for example, be shareholders that don't really take any part in the shareholders' meetings, don't vote. They just simply hold the investment and don't really give any input into the business. We also will have voluntary and involuntary stakeholders. Voluntary stakeholders will be those who interact with the business through choice. So, for example, they would be customers who choose to buy your products. Or involuntary stakeholders, those who are impacted by your decisions, whether they like it or not. So, for example, maybe you have a factory in a certain community. Well, involuntary stakeholders would be those who are affected by perhaps environmental impact of that factory. So we'd need to consider both the voluntary, those who choose to interact with us, and the involuntary stakeholders and classify them as such. So what do we do with these stakeholders? How do we actually decide who we're going to deal with? Well, Mendelot put forward a power interest matrix that looked like this to try and decide how we're going to treat our stakeholders. So on the left-hand side, we had the power of the stakeholder. Along the bottom, we have the interest of the stakeholder. So in the bottom left corner, we have those stakeholders who have high power but a low level of interest. So they're very powerful, but they don't have much interest. They would be, for example, passive stakeholders. Well, for those guys, we're going to need to keep them satisfied. We don't have to do much to do that because they don't have that much interest. But if we did something that irritated or annoyed them, they've got a lot of power, so they could make life difficult for us if that was to occur. So those guys we need to keep satisfied. If they have high power but high interest, they will be key players. Those are the ones we really will need to identify. Those are the ones we'll need to keep informed and we'll need to decide how to deal with. Those who still have a high level of interest but have a low amount of power in the top right hand corner, we simply need to keep informed. We don't need to worry about doing too much because if they're not satisfied, there's not much they can do because they've got low power. And for those stakeholders who have low power and a low level of interest, well, that's minimal effort in the top left-hand corner. We don't really have to do much for them because they simply don't have the power to affect us if something was done that they didn't like. So that's how we can identify who we need to deal with. How do we then deal with the relationship with stakeholders? Well, the first thing we'll do is we'll assess the importance of those stakeholders. So that would feed into the power matrix that we just talked about. Do they have a lot of power? If they do, we'll need to consider them. Do they also have a legitimate interest? Remember we said stakeholders are those people who have a legitimate interest in the business. If they don't have a legitimate interest, well then do we really need to consider them? Also, we need to think about the urgency of whatever issue it is that we're trying to deal with that particular stakeholder. So if we have assessed the importance and we've decided who we're going to deal with, what if we come into conflict with those stakeholders? How do we resolve the conflict if we have one? Well, there are four main ways to do it. The first one is satisficing. So that is trying to come to a compromise with that particular stakeholder to try to ensure that both parties are satisfied. If you have a lot of stakeholders, it may be that you need to turn to sequential attention. That's because you've too many stakeholders to deal with them all at once, so they'll need to take turns and you'll deal with the issues as and when it becomes the turn of that stakeholder. Now, it may be that you'll therefore look at the most important stakeholders first and deal with them first, so take them in turn in order of importance. Side payments would be to give appeasement to certain stakeholders, give them a little bit of what they want so that they are happy for a certain period of time until you can deal with the issue as a whole. Or simply you could exercise your power. If you're in a deadlock with a stakeholder, well, you may have to simply say, well, look, this is the way things are going to be. So those are the four ways we could deal with any conflict that we have with our particular stakeholders. But ultimately, why do we need to bother with our stakeholders? Well, the first thing we could think of is the instrumental view of stakeholders. This is basically saying that stakeholders could affect our objectives. So we need to use those stakeholders. We don't want them to block what we want to do. If they were to block what we want to do, that could damage the company. So this is not saying we have any moral obligation to stakeholders. It's simply saying that, well, if we don't keep these stakeholders happy, they could affect what we want to do. They could prevent us from doing what we want to do. So that would damage our company. So we need to keep those stakeholders happy. On the other hand, we could take a normative view. The normative view says that we have a moral duty to stakeholders, and that would be for social cohesion. So therefore, we need to think about those stakeholders and we need to undertake our moral duty to those stakeholders, keep them informed and deal with them in a socially responsible way. So let's bring all of this together in illustration 1 and see how this sort of area of corporate social responsibility can come up. So read through the scenario, think about what it's asking, and maybe even have a go at illustration 1 before working through the answer with me to learn from it. The requirement in illustration 1 is to first of all define stakeholder and then explain the importance of identifying all of the stakeholders in the stadium project. So make sure you've read the scenario so you know what we're talking about. And the first part of this then is to define stakeholder. So there are a few definitions you could use. Remember, we talked about having a legitimate interest in the business. So that means either you will affect the business or the business will affect you. So there are a number of definitions of a stakeholder. Freeman, for example, defined a stakeholder in terms of any organisation or person that can affect or be affected by the policies or activities of an entity. And that's a good explanation of what a stakeholder is. So hence stakeholding can result from one of two directions: being able to affect and possibly influence an organisation, or conversely being influenced by that organisation. Any engagement with an organisation in whom a stake is held may be voluntary or involuntary in nature, and we discussed voluntary and involuntary stakeholders in the lecture. So let's think now about the importance of identifying the stakeholders in this scenario. So there are many stakeholders that can either affect or be affected by the building of this football stadium. The stakeholders in the stadium project will include the local government authority, because remember the traffic flow is going to be affected by this football stadium. The local residents, their gardens will be affected. The wildlife centre, it might affect those water levels. The local school who visit the wildlife centre, and of course the football club's fans who will be going to the stadium to see the football matches. So stakeholder identification is necessary to gain an understanding of the sources of risks and disruption, because some external stakeholders, such as the local government authority, will offer a risk to the project, and knowledge of the nature of the claim made upon the football club by that stakeholder will be important in the risk assessment. So really, if that local government authority says that you can't get planning permission for this stadium, well, that's going to scupper the plan altogether. So you need to understand that stakeholder in order to think about the risks to this particular project. Stakeholder identification is important in terms of assessing the sources of influence over the objectives and outcomes of the project. So this is Mendelow's model that we talked about in the lecture. In strategic analysis, remember, the stakeholder influence is assessed in terms of their power and their interest, with the high power and high interest combining to generate the highest influence. So we've got to identify the stakeholders and say whether they're powerful or whether they have influence or not. So in this case, it's likely that the fans are more influential on the club's objectives than, for example, the local wildlife centre, as they have more economic power over the club. The fans are the ones going to the club, to the stadium, and providing the revenue. So they're going to have more power to affect the club than, for example, that wildlife centre. It's necessary in order to identify areas of conflict and tension between stakeholders, and especially relevant whenever it's likely that stakeholders of influence will be in disagreement over the outcomes for the project. In this case, for example, the claims of the football club board and the local residents are in conflict. And we talked in the lecture about how, if we're in conflict with stakeholders, how we can go about resolving those conflicts. So that's the importance of identifying the stakeholders in a scenario such as this. So we now understand that our impact will be on stakeholders when we undertake our corporate social responsibility, and we understand which of those stakeholders we need to focus on given their power and given their interest. So summing all of this corporate social responsibility up, we can say that the business should try to be a good corporate citizen. So we mentioned it right at the start, corporate citizenship. So corporate citizenship is looking at corporate social responsibility. It's taking it beyond stakeholders, beyond what we've just discussed, those people that will be affected by or can affect the business. And we're thinking about its impact on society. So what impact can that business have on society? So some of the impacts we need to consider and think about when we're thinking about being a good corporate citizen are competition and abuse of power. So maybe being a monopoly, or maybe abusing the power that you have in the market to set prices that abuse the consumer. So competition and abuse of power, we need to be a good corporate citizen and not abuse the power that we have. Also, we need to consider the impact in low-wage economies. A lot of big businesses have their production lines in low-wage economies and pay very, very low wages. Is that right? Should they be doing it? Well, they need to consider that when they're considering their corporate citizenship. Most of this is down to self-regulation. There are laws in place for the corporate citizen to actually abide with, but to go beyond that, to think about the impact on society, to think about the ethics, well, that's self-regulation. The business needs to think about those things itself. So all of this that we've talked about in this lecture could be summed up in being a good corporate citizen and considering those different areas that we've talked about throughout. So that was our lecture on corporate social responsibility. Make sure you know Carroll's model, the 4 different areas, and make sure you can discuss and identify stakeholders. Those are the 2 key areas here.